He was days away from marrying her when she said this, and he finally saw who she really was. The wedding is in days. Not weeks. Not months. Days. And he is sitting alone, completely silent, wondering if he is about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Not because of cold feet. Not because of nerves. Because the woman he is supposed to marry just called his mother an idiot over a disagreement about car logistics. Let that sink in for a second before we even get into the rest of this. This is the story of a man who spent 4 years loving someone, 1 year planning a future with her, and one single afternoon finally seeing her clearly. The fight was about how to get to the wedding venue. Not money. Not family values. Not a fundamental incompatibility. The route from the hairdresser to the venue. That is what cracked everything open. And honestly, maybe it needed to. Our poster is a 29-year-old man who has been with his fiancée for 4 years. By all accounts he loved her. He committed to her. He put a ring on it. And after the engagement, something shifted. He describes it as things getting worse and worse, big fights, escalating tension that he kept chalking up to wedding planning stress. A lot of couples go through that. Planning a wedding is genuinely hard. It costs money, it involves families, it surfaces every unresolved disagreement about priorities and values. You are suddenly making hundreds of small decisions together under time pressure, with other people's opinions layered on top of your own, and every choice feels like it carries more weight than it probably should. The flowers, the seating chart, the guest list, the timeline. All of it compounds. So he gave her grace. He told himself it was the circumstances. He reminded himself that she was probably overwhelmed, that he was probably overwhelmed too, and that the version of her he had fallen in love with would return once the planning was behind them. He kept pushing through, month after month, absorbing the friction and filing it under temporary. But here is the thing about making excuses for someone you love. You can do it for so long that you stop noticing how much you are doing it. You normalize the tension. You absorb the criticism. You start measuring your own emotional well-being against how bad the last fight was rather than against how things should actually feel. Each time things calm down, you feel relief, and you mistake that relief for happiness. You forget what it felt like before the tightness set in. He says he has been feeling depressed. He says he feels like he is being emotionally abused. Those are not small words. Those are words a person reaches for only after they have already exhausted every softer explanation, every gentler framing, every version of the story that kept the other person in a more flattering light. You do not land on words like that quickly. You arrive at them slowly, reluctantly, after a long time of trying not to. And then we get to the day of this post. The actual fight. The one that made him stop and ask the internet whether canceling the wedding makes him a bad person. The disagreement was logistical, almost comically small on the surface. Should they go to the venue directly from the hairdresser, or stop at his parents' home first? That is it. That is the entire origin point of what followed. A question of routing. A few minutes of travel time, at most. He did not even know it was a significant issue for her, did not know she had been quietly building tension around it, because it was the kind of detail that should not carry any emotional weight at all. When she brought it up as a source of tension, his first instinct was exactly what you would hope for in a partner. He tried to diffuse it immediately. He told her they could do whatever she wanted. He handed her the decision without resistance, without negotiation, without even making her explain her reasoning. He just offered her the win, cleanly and without strings, because he wanted the air to clear and the moment to pass. She did not take the win. Instead, she accused him of being a mama's boy. She accused his mother of making him fight her battles, which is a deeply strange thing to say to someone who has just told you they will do whatever you prefer. There was no battle being fought. There was no defense being mounted. There was only a man standing there with his hands open, and she looked at that and decided it was an attack. Then she called his mother an idiot. Not a disagreement about judgment, not a frustration with a decision, but a flat, contemptuous dismissal of the woman who raised him. And then, as a finishing move, as though the previous two escalations had not already done enough damage, she said she wanted to break up. Over the route to the venue. Days before the wedding. I need to pause here because the audacity of that escalation is something I want to sit with for a moment. He did not escalate. He did not attack her back. He did not match her contempt with his own or say something he could not take back. Instead, he said this was a big decision to be making this close to the wedding and that she was being hurtful and he needed some time before continuing the conversation. Think about what that actually takes. He had just been called a mama's boy. His mother had just been called an idiot. His fiancée had just threatened to end their relationship days before they were supposed to stand in front of everyone they loved and make a lifelong promise. And his response was calm. Measured. He named the hurt without weaponizing it, and he asked for space so the conversation would not get worse. That is not weakness. That is someone actively choosing not to burn everything down when they would have had every justification to. 5 or 6 hours passed. He sat with it, presumably turning the whole thing over in his head, trying to figure out what was real and what was reactionary, trying to decide what kind of conversation he even wanted to walk back into. And then he called her. And here is where the story gets darker in a very specific way. She told him that during those same hours he had been quietly trying to process and stabilize himself, she had already spoken to her family about breaking up with him. She had already consulted friends. She had already constructed a narrative, gathered witnesses to her version of events, and built her support network around a breakup that had not yet been decided, all because he had not called fast enough to apologize. Not because he had done something wrong. Because the apology had not arrived on her preferred timeline. The word apologize is doing a lot of work in that sentence. She expected him to apologize. For what, exactly? For not knowing which route she wanted to take. For needing a few hours to settle down after being told his mother was an idiot. For having the audacity to say he needed time to think before continuing a conversation that had turned cruel without warning. In her framing, the only correct and acceptable response was for him to come back immediately, humbled and contrite, and ask for forgiveness. And when he did not do that fast enough, she did not wait. She did not sit with the discomfort of unresolved tension the way he was doing. She did not reflect on what she had said or how quickly things had escalated from a logistics question to a threat of dissolution. She started dismantling the relationship in real time, on the phone with her family, recruiting people to her side, while he was somewhere trying to gather himself and find his footing. That is not how someone who loves you acts when things get hard. That is how someone acts when they are more interested in winning than in repairing. When he finally called and she told him all of this, he said she was out of her mind and that he wanted time to think about whether he actually wanted to go through with the wedding. And that is the moment he posted to the internet. Raw and shaken, sitting with the weight of a wedding days away and no clear answer about what to do with any of it. You can almost feel the specific quality of that silence he must have been sitting in. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something loud, when your ears are still ringing and you are not sure yet what you are going to do next. Let us talk about what emotional abuse actually looks like in a relationship, because it rarely looks like the obvious dramatic scenes people imagine. It does not always announce itself loudly. It does not always look like shouting or cruelty or obvious control. It lives in patterns. It lives in the way someone reacts to small disagreements with disproportionate anger that seems to come from nowhere and leaves you confused about what just happened. It lives in the way conflict always somehow becomes your fault regardless of how it started or how reasonably you tried to respond. It lives in the way you find yourself apologizing constantly, not because you did something wrong, but because apologizing is the only lever that stops the spiral and brings the temperature back down. Over time, you stop questioning whether you should apologize. You just do it, reflexively, because the alternative feels worse. He used the phrase emotionally abused himself. He did not reach for that word lightly. Nobody does. That word costs something to say out loud. The pattern he describes over the course of this relationship, the escalating fights after the engagement, the depression, the feeling of walking on eggshells, these are not the symptoms of a relationship having a rough patch. These are the symptoms of a relationship that has a structural problem. A rough patch is temporary friction between two people who fundamentally function well together. What he is describing is a dynamic where tension is the baseline, where he is always absorbing and managing and excusing, where things are getting worse rather than better despite time passing and circumstances remaining largely stable. Structural problems do not get fixed by surviving the wedding. They get worse once the escape routes start to feel less available and the stakes of conflict feel higher. Here is something worth considering about the timing of all of this. Engagements are often when controlling or emotionally volatile behavior accelerates, not decreases. The engagement creates a sense of ownership. The wedding creates a deadline. The marriage creates permanence. Every step feels like a tightening of a knot, and for someone whose behavior trends toward control or emotional volatility, that tightening can bring out the worst in them, because the feeling of security that comes with each milestone can quietly remove whatever incentive existed to keep the harder edges hidden. He noticed things got worse after the engagement. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern worth taking seriously. Now let us talk about whether he would be the bad guy for canceling. Canceling a wedding days before it happens is genuinely painful and logistically complicated. People have traveled. Deposits have been paid. Family members have rearranged their lives and are already emotionally invested in the day. There is real social and financial fallout, real awkwardness and grief and disappointment that ripples outward to people who did nothing wrong and do not deserve to be caught in the middle of it. None of that is nothing. Those costs are real and they matter. But every single one of those costs is a one-time cost. Every single one of those problems can eventually be resolved, absorbed, forgiven, or simply moved past with enough time. A bad marriage is not a one-time cost. A bad marriage is years of your life, accumulated slowly. It is your mental health, daily. It is every future conflict filtered through a dynamic that has already shown you exactly who it becomes when things get tense. The idea that canceling a wedding makes you the bad guy assumes that going through with the wedding would have been fine. But the evidence in this post does not point to fine. It points to a man who has been feeling depressed inside his own relationship, who used the word abuse to describe his experience, who watched his fiancée respond to a minor logistical disagreement by calling his mother an idiot and threatening to leave, and who then watched her spend the next several hours not sitting with the discomfort of an unresolved fight but actively building a case and a coalition against him. That is not a partner. That is not someone to build a life with. He is not the bad guy here. He is someone who finally reached the edge of what he could rationalize away and had the courage to stop and ask whether this was actually right. Most people do not ask that question clearly until it is much harder to act on it. He is asking it now, with the doors still technically open. The bravest thing he could do, for himself and honestly for her too, is to be honest about what this relationship has been showing him and to trust that clarity rather than override it with the pressure of a date on a calendar. Canceling is not a failure. Sometimes calling something off before it becomes permanent is the most honest act of love you are capable of. She stood up for a stranger at a restaurant and her friends made her feel like the villain. 10:05 p.m. She put on a sweatshirt. It is 80 degrees outside, she is sitting at an outdoor table celebrating the biggest night of her young life, and she put on a heavy sweatshirt because a stranger at the next table made her feel like her skin was something to be ashamed of. That image alone should make something rise in your chest. And the narrator of tonight's second story felt that rise too, and she actually did something about it. This story comes from a woman in her 20s who was out to dinner when she witnessed something that shifted the energy of an entire restaurant. A high school girl was there celebrating her graduation. She was wearing a backless sleeveless dress and she had some acne on her back. The kind of thing nobody would have clocked in any normal situation. The kind of thing that is completely ordinary and completely human. She was dressed up. She had probably spent time getting ready. She may have felt beautiful that evening, the way you feel on a night that is supposed to belong to you. Then a young man at another table, who the poster notes had an apparent intellectual disability, pointed at her and said loudly that she had pimples all over her back, that it was gross, that people did not want to see it while eating, and that she should go home. The girl said nothing. Her party said nothing. She quietly excused herself to the restroom and came back in a heavy sweatshirt. She covered herself up. At her own graduation dinner. Because a stranger made her feel like her body was a problem. Think about what that walk to the restroom must have felt like. Think about her standing in front of a mirror in a restaurant bathroom on what was supposed to be one of the best nights of her life, pulling a sweatshirt over a dress she had chosen carefully, and then having to walk back out and sit down and smile and pretend everything was fine. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is one of the most quietly devastating things in this entire story. His comments did not stop there. He continued making loud remarks about her appearance, about his ruined appetite, about her supposed poor hygiene, about how inconsiderate it was of her to have visible acne in a restaurant. Each comment landed in that particular way that public humiliation does, where the target has to sit perfectly still and absorb it while everyone around them tries not to make eye contact. His parents apologized to the girl's family but did not take any action to stop it. And his mother, in an attempt to smooth things over, told the graduation girl that his behavior meant he liked her. Which is the kind of deflection that tells you everything about how this behavior had been handled, or more accurately not handled, for a long time. It was the response of people who had learned that a quick apology was the only currency they needed to spend. The girls' party responded with grace. They told the family not to worry about it. But the mood in the restaurant had shifted completely. Other diners were visibly uncomfortable, that particular communal tension that fills a room when something unkind is happening in public and everyone is silently calculating whether it is their place to say something. One table got up, presumably to complain to staff, but nothing came of it on a busy evening. And then he made more loud comments. And that is the moment our poster decided she had heard enough. She walked over to his table and told them directly that this was making her uncomfortable and that they needed to do something, that it had become disruptive. She did not yell. She did not make a performance of it. She stood at that table and said clearly and calmly that something needed to change, because what was happening was not acceptable and everyone in that restaurant could feel it even if no one else was willing to say it out loud. The family apologized to her. And then also did nothing. Eventually the restaurant moved the family to a different area, though the parents made clear they felt this was unfair given that their son had not intended any harm. And our poster's own friends told her afterwards that she should not have gotten involved, that she had embarrassed them and possibly made things worse for the girl. Now she is second-guessing herself. And I want to address that directly. The argument from her friends rests on the idea that intent excuses impact. That because the young man did not mean harm, his words did not cause harm, and therefore no intervention was warranted. But that argument falls apart the moment you look at the girl in the sweatshirt. She did not experience an absence of harm. She experienced a full, real, embodied response to being publicly humiliated. She covered her body. She altered herself. On her graduation night. Intent did not protect her from any of that. The parents had already demonstrated twice that apologizing was the full extent of their response. They apologized to the girl's family. They apologized to our poster. Both times they did nothing to actually change the situation. The staff had not acted. The other table that appeared to have complained had produced no result. The status quo was that this girl was going to sit through more comments about her skin at her graduation dinner while everyone around her managed their discomfort quietly. Our poster changed that status quo. She walked over and said clearly and directly that something needed to happen. That is not embarrassing. That is exactly what being a decent person in a public space looks like. We have this cultural habit of treating non-intervention as neutral, as if staying in your seat and saying nothing is a morally weightless choice. But it is not. When you have the ability to speak and you choose silence, you are making a choice. Our poster made the other choice. Her friend's concern that she made things worse for the girl is worth examining though, because it comes from a place of genuine care even if the conclusion is wrong. The worry is that drawing more attention to the situation added to the girl's embarrassment. But the situation was already highly visible. Everyone in that restaurant already knew what was happening. The girl had already been humiliated multiple times. The comments had been loud enough to carry across the room and disrupt the meals of people who had nothing to do with any of it. The intervention did not create a scene. It added an adult voice saying that this was not acceptable, and shortly after, the restaurant moved the disruptive party. That is not making things worse. That is the thing that finally produced an outcome. There is also something important to say about the disability framing that the parents leaned on heavily. The young man's apparent intellectual disability is real and it matters in terms of understanding why he behaved the way he did. He was not being deliberately cruel in the way someone without his condition might be. That context is genuinely relevant to how we understand his intent. But his disability does not remove the responsibility of the adults around him to manage the impact of his behavior in a public space. His parents were present. They were there. They had the ability to redirect him, to remove him from the situation, to be more actively engaged, and they consistently chose the path of least resistance, which was to apologize and then continue. That pattern of behavior, apologizing without acting, is what created the conditions for our poster to feel she had no choice but to step in. The apology had become a ritual. A way of acknowledging the problem without taking any responsibility for solving it. Our poster is not the villain of this story. She is one of the only people in that restaurant who treated the situation as one that required actual action rather than polite tolerance. Her friends are entitled to their opinion, but their discomfort with confrontation does not make her wrong. What she did required courage. It required her to stand up, cross a room full of people who were all choosing to stay seated, walk over to a stranger's table, and say clearly that something needed to change. That is uncomfortable. That is socially risky. Most people calculate that risk and decide it is not their problem. She did it anyway because a girl in a sweatshirt at her graduation dinner had already absorbed more than she should have had to. Because she looked at that table and saw someone who had stopped being able to enjoy her own night and decided that mattered more than her own comfort. Not the bad guy. Not even close. She is the person that girl will probably think about for a long time, even if they never spoke directly. She is the stranger who decided the comfortable option was not good enough. Drop a comment below telling me which story hit harder. I genuinely want to know. And if you are still here, a like and subscribe means everything, it really does.